Between 2016 and 2021, fires inflicted damage on over 74,000 square meters of teaching facilities. And again, sort of looking at the graphics there, that's about 10 football pitches back to back, which is a huge area. And when you sort of take a deeper look into what are the causations of this, unfortunately, schools are the prime target for arson attacks. They top the list of vulnerable buildings. Shockingly, 1 in 20 schools annually face a fire, with 60% of those being deliberate acts. And a staggering 85% of property losses in schools stem directly from fire damage.
So on the BB100, which is a bit of a starting point and is kind of similar within the technical handbook for the Scottish sector, what the BB100 is trying to define with its key objectives is to basically define that there are an element of prevention, detection, evacuation, containment, and protection. And obviously what it's trying to do here with this BB100, it's not a statutory guidance, as always. These are guidances that say, these is what, if you follow, you are likely to comply then with document B and the law of the order. So it's down to your choice of how to get there, but these guidances give you the stepping stones to achieve those. We've got these places of special fire hazards. So it does actually declare that there are certain rooms that must become fire hazard specialities, and they must be fire stopped accordingly. So even if it's a single story with a large compartment aspect, but you've got a kitchen or a boiler room, then those rooms do need to be fire stopped, and especially at least to a 60 minutes. If you notice there, it says E60. That means the actual integrity is 60. It's not defining that the insulation must be at 60 minutes either. So those are giving us those guidances, and that can be found on BB100, page 124, appendix point. So continuing with some of the core components, of course, the escape routes, which is something that have to be clearly marked, but it is actually a requirement in your guidance that you must check your escape routes very frequently. How do you do that? You have to walk the route and make sure that nothing is an obstacle in that way, and you have to show evidence that you've done these type of things. So that's part of your normal ongoing maintenance of fire safety within the actual schools. But there's always that question about the final exit door. So the final exit door, does it actually need to be a fire rated door? Because some of the walls don't need to be fire rated that are on the outside, but some do. And those that are doing to be fire exits with fire rated solutions are particularly the doors that exit onto a staircase that leads on externally of the building. So if you've got the top floor, 3 floors, then at least the ground and the first and the second need to be fire rated doors, because you've got students and pupils walking down the staircase above you. So that door has to become an actual fire rated solution. Fire protection, detection, alarm systems. So if your school is 1 story and less than 160 pupils, then you can have a handbell. I mean, that says how old and outdated the BB100 is, but it does clearly say if you've got a small enough school, you can have a handbell, as long as you can make sure it's rung and shook loud enough for everyone to hear. So that's defined as an M system, a manual system. And then you'll see the topics of L and P. L is for life and P is for property. So there are, obviously in the bigger schools, there's an absolute must, and they must be maintained, as you know, according to the regulations of BS 9999. There are clear indications of the frequency of inspections. Flexible scheduling. Yes, of course, we can work around the half terms, and we can do early mornings and overnight works and weekends just to get around the aspect of getting into the premises while the schools are either occupied or during holidays. And yes, we take the seriousness of safety measures quite seriously. DBS checks are done on all our operatives, and we also make our sites very safe. And if we are doing door exchanges, they are done in the same day, so there is no exposure to fire risk of unattended aspects.
Risk assessments should be suitable and sufficient. That's what legislation says. It's interesting that the legislation doesn't actually say what makes something suitable and sufficient. So while the legislation says, yes, oh, your risk assessment must be suitable and sufficient, it doesn't actually say what that actually means. So it can be a little bit tricky. Building Safety Act and Section 156 is pertinent to fire risk assessments because that, again, alters the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. So now all the findings of the risk assessment have to be documented, not just the significant findings. I always wondered what's an insignificant finding of a risk assessment. So all findings, and it's good. So it gives you, the thing with all findings is it gives you a picture of what your building's behaving like. I always treat buildings as if they're real and people, because they'll do things and they will move and they'll be grumpy and they will change. So having all the findings of a fire risk assessment enables you to see what your building is up to. When I talk about fire risk assessments, I tend to talk about what fire risk isn't, because there's a lot of confusion. It's not a full audit of all the areas that are readily accessible. Fire risk assessors will and should sample areas, but they're not going to do a full inspection. It's not a means of verifying compliance with building regulations. If you have any new building works done, it's down to the builders to comply with building regulations. The risk assessor will assume that you've managed to do it right. And it's not a disabled access audit. Risk assessors will think about people with limited mobility, people with any disability, but it's not a disabled access audit. It's also not a means of snagging new construction. Often risk assessors will be sent in to do a new build when it's not even occupied. And half of the risk assessment is what people are actually doing in the building, because I can design and build you a building that will never have a fire, never have an issue, as long as you do one thing for me. Don't put any people in there, because it's the people that do things. And it's the people that wedge fire doors. It's the people that will come along and install new cables through fire-resistant barriers and not seal the hole. But if you let me build it and not let people in, it will be safe. So people are a problem. It's not a means for verifying that your resistance to structural elements is adequate. It's not an examination of potential collapse in the event of fire. It's not a fire strategy report. It's not a guide for legislation either. It's something required by legislation. It's not there to explain the legislation to the responsible person. So we need hazard identification. We need, which includes any policy or procedures. And I've split policy and practice for a reason, because people will have policies in place. My question is, yes, you've got a really good policy to manage this. Do you actually do it that way? Do you follow your own policy? And it's like, well, we don't really do it that way because it's a bit complicated and a bit difficult. So you've immediately fallen over because you're not following your own policy. So policy and practice are two different things. They're not always the same. And we need to look at consequences. Again, policy and practice. We need to assessment of the likelihood. We need to assessment of the likelihood of fire. That feeds into the action plan, into the risk assessment, feeds into the action plan, which then feeds back. So it is a circular thing. And I was really interested in the responses to the question of when do you do an FRA? Every 12 months, every 2 years, or unsure. You never stop doing an FRA. Anytime your building changes, well, that changes the risk assessment. And if you look at this diagram here and you'll see, well, this is a circular thing. Yes, it is. Because you should always be thinking about fire safety. What have I done that can now affect my risk assessment? So risk assessment should be constantly reviewed, and then maybe you need to do it a whole again. It's what have I changed? what's altered. Now, with schools, you get a whole new set of people come in who have never been in the building before every year. So something changes every year. And how are you managing that for your part of the risk assessment? Because they'll only need to know about means of escape, fire drills, etc., etc.